Have you ever been falsely accused? Has anyone ever spread gossip or falsehood or innuendo about you? Unfortunately, the answer to those questions is probably yes. But the question for us today is, how do we respond to that? How do we handle that? Well, that's what we're going to talk about on this special Easter edition of the Full Life Podcast. Welcome, everyone, to the Full Life Podcast by Grace Church, where we hope to inspire, challenge, and clarify your next steps in faith. I'm David Lawson, and this is a third podcast in a series of podcasts that we are recording leading up to Easter as we prepare our hearts for Easter. And we're talking about these events, and we're talking about the historical settings and events that are leading up to Jesus' crucifixion in his last days, and also even up to his resurrection. But more importantly, we're talking about the spiritual significance of those events to our lives. What we're going to be talking about today, a lesson that we'll be able to pull out from what we're going to be discussing today, is how do we react when people wrong us or we are unjustly accused. My guess is that has probably been your experience at some point of your life, and we're going to be learning from Jesus about how we respond in those kinds of situations. And again, I have with me Pastor Bob Federhoff, our pastor of development at Grace Church here in Worcester, and he will be with me throughout this series of podcasts. So welcome again, Bob. Glad you could be with us.
Thank you. It's nice to be back.
Well, so far we've talked about the Last Supper, we've talked about the Garden of Gethsemane, and now we're going to be talking about this last event leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus, that is Jesus' trial, or trials maybe, as it were, which might be kind of a surprise to people. They might not know that all that was involved with Jesus' trial. We put it under one as a singular trial, but actually there was a lot more to it than that. And spoiler alert, part of the reason for this is because no one could really pin anything on him. And in many ways, he was just certainly unjustly accused, but we'll get to that in just a moment. So let's start a little bit with the historical information. Let's talk about where did these trials take place?
Well, as you've suggested, David, there actually are 6 parts to Jesus' trial.
6 parts.
There were 3 stages in the religious court and 3 stages before a Roman court. Now, for the religious leaders, Jesus was tried by 3 different sets of people. First, he was on trial before Annas, the former high priest. Then he was on trial before Caiaphas, the one who was the current high priest at that time. Then he was tried before the group of 70 elders, Jewish leaders, called the Sanhedrin. In those religious trials, he was charged with blasphemy, simply, claiming to be the Son of God. That's a legitimate claim.
Guilty as charged.
Yeah, he was. In that respect, that's exactly what he claimed, and they couldn't handle it, of course. Now, it's interesting, as a side note, to realize that one of the places that we often visit in the Holy Land is called the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantu, which means the church where the cock crowed. And it's probably a church that was actually built over the house of Caiaphas, because there's a very, very old dungeon down below that you can visit, and Jesus may well have been held there and tried there. The trials that happened before the Jewish authorities were illegal in every case because they simply hated him and they wanted to dispose of him. No trial, for instance, was supposed to be held during a time of the feast.
Right.
Well, it was the time of the Passover.
Right.
If a death penalty was given, a night had to pass before the sentence could be carried out. That didn't happen at all either. That wasn't the case. The Jews had no authority in themselves to execute anyone. I mean, there were many violations of the law that actually happened during the religious trial of Jesus himself.
So basically what you're telling me is this whole thing was a sham, even on the religious side, simply because they didn't like him, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was a kangaroo court. Nothing legitimate whatsoever. in the way that Jesus was tried by the religious leaders.
So what was it about Jesus? And this might be obvious to a lot of people who are listening, but maybe not to others. Why was Jesus hated so much by the religious leaders?
Well, I think there were two primary reasons. Jesus claimed to speak for God.
Mm-hmm.
You see, in Jesus' day, the religious leaders claimed not their own authority, but they claimed their authority based on what somebody else said, according to what somebody said before him. It was kind of authority passed down from one generation to another. A little bit like the way some of us write papers, you know? We think we're really being an authority if we can cite a whole bunch of different people who happen to agree with us.
And when I read the Gospels, the crowds, one of their statements, he teaches with such authority. Right. And what they weren't referring to was, well, he isn't saying what somebody else said. Yeah. He's kind of bringing his own thing.
He taught with his own authority. Right. He didn't quote everybody else, didn't quote all the rabbis of the past, which is what was typical of the religious leaders of Jesus' day. He taught with his own authority. That's the first reason why they hated him so much. He was teaching unlike any of them would dare to do, because they gained their authority from being able to quote the experts of the past. The second reason that they hated him so much, I think, was because he had a completely different agenda than they did. He was focused on spiritual realities. He was focused on having a right relationship with God. He was focused on the spiritual concepts that were behind what became the focus of the religious leaders of his day. The focus of their attention was the Sabbath and the food and their ethnic identity and the land and ultimately the temple itself. All those things were the symbols of what was supposed to be great spiritual reality.
Yeah, and so you hear this in Jesus' teaching all the time, where he said, you've heard it said this.
That's right.
I tell you this. And a lot of times what he was getting at is you need to get beyond the practice to the heart. You need to get, I'm concerned, his teaching was about who you are as a person, not as much about the outward appearance, because he was saying you can do everything seemingly right in the eyes of people, but be corrupt on the inside.
Exactly. And of course, maybe his most bold statement about that was when he called them whitewashed tombs.
Yeah, they probably didn't like that.
You look great maybe on the outside, but inwardly you're rotten to the core. They were focused only on the external, and Jesus was focused on the internal, having a right relationship with God.
Yeah. So this is probably the surprise to people, and that is that there were two types of trials. You had these religious trials, but then there's also the civil side of things, where he goes before the Roman authorities. Let's talk about that a little bit. You've talked a little bit about him going before the priests and the Pharisees. Let's talk a little bit about his trial before the Romans in the civil trials.
Now, again, Jesus appeared before three different stages in his civil trial before the Roman authorities. First, he appeared before Pilate, and then Pilate found no reason to kill Jesus, so he shipped him off to King Herod. And Herod didn't want to have anything to do with him, so he ridiculed him, and he wanted to avoid the political liability that would be associated with any kind of condemnation of Jesus, because he knew Jesus was a popular figure.
Right.
And if Herod was anything, he was astute when it came to the winds of human popularity. So he sent him back to Pilate. So he went from Pilate to Herod, back to Pilate, and the last trial before Pilate was basically to appease this growing animosity that the Jews had toward Jesus. And Pilate even offered to the Jews the release of Barabbas, but instead they sought the crucifixion of Christ.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about that scene where the people are shouting for Jesus' crucifixion and asking for the release of Barabbas. Let's talk about the significance that is to what insight would you give to us about that particular event?
Well, for one thing, it was complete mockery of the justice system.
Yeah.
because here was a man who was clearly a criminal,
Right.
Barabbas, an insurrectionist who led rebellion against the Roman government. He was guilty, clearly, being offered, on the one hand, in contrast to Jesus, who was completely innocent of the accusations that were brought against him. Somebody said it's not bragging if you can back it up. You said earlier that Jesus was guilty of claiming to be the Son of God.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
He was. But he backed it up
Right.
by
Exactly.
the miracles that he performed.
Right.
So his innocence was what rested in the fact that the charges against him were false.
Right.
Not that they were wrong.
Right.
They were false.
Right. Good distinction. Yeah.
He was charged with claiming to be God. He did claim to be God. He said, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father."
Right.
Now, the trouble was they were saying he, being a man, made himself out to be God. Like he wasn't really God when he made that claim.
Right.
But the truth of the matter was he was God.
Yeah. Amen.
And he had all the right to make that claim. So his innocence was in the fact that what they charged him with falsely just wasn't the case about him. He wasn't a man claiming to be God who wasn't God. He was a man claiming to be God who was God.
Yeah. And this thing about Barabbas too and Jesus is we're guilty. Just like Barabbas was clearly guilty.
That's right.
And we are guilty. And yet Jesus was offered in exchange for Barabbas, and Jesus was offered in exchange for us, for our guilt. He took on our sin, our guilt, our punishment, our just punishment. He took it on himself. It's just another foreshadowing what Jesus was going to be doing for us at the cross. And most people may have heard about Pilate. There are some people who haven't. If they haven't heard about Pilate, they've probably said something similar to what Pilate has said. If you've ever said before, "Well, I wash my hands of this," well, that's basically what Pilate did. He said, "I'm just going to wash my hands of it." And he said, I'm basically what he was saying is, I'm not going to be held responsible for the death of this man because I can't find any guilt in him, and I am innocent, he said, of this man's blood. And so even though we might not be as familiar with the historical figure, a lot of things that we say today are influenced by the words of Pilate in the past. And just like the other two events that we've already talked about this day, this one also has some pretty significant spiritual significance to us. We've dabbled in that a little bit already, but why don't you talk to us a little bit about what you think would be some spiritual significance that we can pull out of the lessons from Jesus' trial?
Well, I think one of those things is that it's possible for a person to be declared not guilty in our country and yet still be guilty of a crime.
True.
The burden is on the prosecution to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody is guilty. And if the prosecution doesn't do that, the person is declared not guilty. Now, that person may still be guilty of the crime, but the prosecution hasn't been able to prove that they're guilty of the crime.
Right.
However, in Jesus' case, Jesus was not found guilty. Even Pilate said, "I find no fault in this man."
Right.
Pilate found him innocent. It was crucial for Jesus to be innocent in order to fulfill the imagery of the perfect, spotless Lamb of God, the one who would die in our place on the cross for all of our sin. Again, Paul just said, "He who knew no sin became sin for us so that we might experience the righteousness of God in him."
Yeah.
I can't ever fathom all that means, but I'm grateful for it.
Yeah, because of the sinlessness of Jesus Christ, as you said, he is able to be that lamb. He's able to be the sacrifice for us. And without his sinlessness, that transaction that we talk about in the substitutionary death of Jesus can't happen. And the transaction I'm talking about is on that cross, Jesus took on our sin, and we received, in God's economy, we received Jesus' righteousness. It was, as it were, imputed to us. It was transferred to us. It's like you go up to a transaction counter and you trade in your sin for the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And that happens by faith. It's by grace you're saved through faith. The grace of God is that he's making available to us this transaction where we can be forgiven and receive his righteousness, and the guilt of our sin can be removed from us, and we can be made right with God. That's the grace of God. But that's only received by faith. We have to trust that Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead were sufficient for forgiveness and life so that we can receive it for ourselves. So when you think about next steps for us spiritually coming out of these lessons that we draw from the trial of Jesus, what applications or next steps do you see coming out of that for us?
Well, remember that Jesus was falsely accused. And the sad reality of life is that can happen to you and me. I've said many times, I don't mind being called on the carpet when I have done something that's wrong.
Yeah.
And I know that I've done something that's wrong. What's hard is when I'm called on the carpet and I don't think I've done anything wrong.
Yeah.
The truth is all of us face moments like that. When we are falsely accused, when we're wrongly accused. The good news is you're not responsible for your reputation. I'm not responsible for my reputation. That's up to God.
Yeah.
What we are responsible before God and before others is our character.
Yeah. Amen.
Who we are before God is what's most important.
That was one of the most significant lessons you taught me. Probably my second day on staff here. It was soon when I met you in your office, and you impressed that upon me. And what you were telling me was that your character matters, and you're responsible for that. You're not responsible for what someone else might say about you or might falsely accuse you of. But you have to have clear conscience, and you have to have, you're the one who's responsible for your character. And of course, Jesus demonstrated that throughout the entire trial. When he could have spoken back, when he could have resisted, he didn't, but he carried on. He let his character carry on his reputation, even though others tried to soil it. Of course, there's a lot more, Bob, we could talk about regarding this particular event in Jesus' life, but I think it gives us an idea of how significant Jesus' life really was and is today, now in heaven. And in our next podcast, we're going to get to Jesus' crucifixion. There is no event in history that has been more characterized by so much bad news and good news at the same time. And so we're going to be exploring that at our next time together. And if you don't have a church home, allow me to encourage you to attend Grace Church in person or online this Easter. You can find information about how to know about our location and the times of our Easter events in the link below, and how to connect with us online. And I trust our time together has been helpful for you again. I'm glad that you could join us for this time. And I trust that in some way your faith has been strengthened and that you are better prepared in your faith for your faith journey. Remember, Jesus came that we might have life and have it to the full. And we pray that you will pursue the full life that God has for you. If you like this video, make sure you like, share, comment, or subscribe to invest in the full life that God has for you.